Hey everyone, it's Alex, and today I'm here with my May reading wrap-up. It is June 2nd, so once again, I'm being on top of things, and I'm very pleased about that. I read 10 books in the month of May. I have 9 of them here. 8 of them were books that were off of my physical TBR. One was a physical library book, ow, and one was an audiobook from the library. 8 books off my TBR is pretty good for a month. I only acquired 3 books last month, so that's 5 that were down in a month off my TBR, and I'm quite pleased with this. So I'm gonna get started, so this hopefully won't be an hour-long video. It has come to my attention that I have a problem with lengthy videos because I sit here talking forever about nothing. The first book that I read in May was A Good Neighborhood by Therese and Fowler. This I read because it was an ARC. I got it from my old job. I've been trying to get through those books, so I've been trying to pick up at least one a month in order to make some progress. This is about 2 families in a neighborhood. There's a white family who's very wealthy and move into this kind of up-and-coming neighborhood. There's some discussion on gentrification. And then there's a black family, a mother and her son who've lived there basically the son's whole life. There's a little bit of a Romeo and Juliet romance between the girl and the boy from each family, and then things go sour, and the book kind of discusses racism as well as some gentrification and just like in general the community. This is such a negative way for me to start off the month and to start off this video. I gave this book 2 stars and I really disliked this. I was not a fan at all. There's very little positive that I can say about this book. It reminded me a bit of Jodi Picoult, so if you like her, maybe you would enjoy this a lot more than me, but it reminded me of a less well done Jodi Picoult book. Like, at least her books have depth. For a book that was largely about racism, this author really enjoyed, I should say Fowler, Fowler really enjoyed having very clear-cut ideas of good and bad, and having very clear-cut characters who were good or bad. There were some very bad people in this book, and then a lot of well-meaning people in the book, and it was very cut and dry. There was no like, oh, well, like, there are lots of shades of gray here. Like, no. There were good people, there were bad people, the end. The characters were all incredibly flat. I'm pretty sure she kind of neglected to have characters rather to have themes that she could just continuously jam down your throat. And I mean, I'm not saying I disagree with any of the themes in this book or any of like her ideas that she was discussing, but she would literally stop the narration to just lecture the reader about the things that were happening and about racism. And coming from a white author, it wasn't a story. Like, so much of this book was not a story. It was a lecture. And if you want to preach, you should write a sermon. There's actually a sermon about racism that I'm planning to listen to at some point. It's on my audiobook wish list. And that I plan to be lectured to. Because, you know, it's a sermon. That's what I'm signing up for. This is a fictional novel. It's supposed to have a story to it. Not a fan. I don't think she handled the racism well at all. Again, I'm white. People have written much longer, much more in-depth reviews and discussions of this book who have a lot more experience than I do, so I do recommend looking those up. I did want to read one quote that I found. I actually found it on Goodreads, and they were quoting an article, and I read the article, which I agreed with too. But like, I wanted to read the quote because it so captured everything I felt about this book before I move on. It provides the same frustration one feels at Thanksgiving when your self-described open-minded aunt won't shut up about the beautiful gay couple she waves to at the gym. It perfectly sums up this whole book. This was not good, and it wasn't even the kind of bad that I wanted to review. Like, this was the kind of bad where I just want to never think about it again. I wouldn't recommend it. I don't think it handled racism well, and I don't think it had hardly any story. It reminded me a little bit of the book Anything But Okay by Sarah Dara Littman, which I don't think I have a review for, but essentially it was the same thing. It was a white author trying to tackle racism and winding up just writing this really preachy book with no characters and no story. It was not good. The one thing about the writing, well, two things about the writing. One, it was very pretentious. It's like one of the most pretentious things I've ever read. And honestly, I usually like pretentious things. I'm usually like, if a book is pretentious, I kind of see that as a plus. Like, ooh, yes, talk to me with this pretty language. Pretend you're deeper than you really are. Like, this is what I like. It was so annoying here. Like, reading this, I was like, I now understand why people hate pretension. Like, I get it. I hated it. And then the writing style, she writes a bit in first person plural, like from the perspective of the neighborhood, kind of reminiscent of the way that Jeffrey Eugenides wrote The Virgin Suicides. And I really love that writing style in The Virgin Suicides. It didn't work here because it would cut in and out of that from the perspective of the neighborhood, this first person, like, we are the neighborhood, we are the voice of the neighborhood, we are the people of the neighborhood, to close third person where you would get the thoughts of like the main characters, and it just didn't make sense. It was so jarring every time it happened. I was so confused, and it just did not work at all. I wasn't a fan of anything in this book. I wouldn't recommend picking it up. There are better books out there. Pretty much any of them, I think, would be better than this. And then we move on to something I did enjoy quite a bit, Still Missing by Beth Gutcheon. This is a book about a mother whose young son goes missing. He's 6, I believe. He's walking to school by himself one day. He might be 7. How old is he? I feel like it's relevant. 6. I was right. He's walking to school one day, and then he never arrives at school, and no one sees him on his route. He just kind of disappears into thin air. And this is the story of his mother. It's not a mystery, it's just this really close look at a woman who's suffered loss and kind of how she deals with it and who she is. And it's really, really compelling. I gave this 4 stars. It is set in the 80s. It's written in the 80s. It's an 80s book. So like, I feel like that's something to know going in, because when I bought it, I don't think I had realized that. And it does like change the way the story is told, because like obviously like it's 40 years old almost. But it was so good. It was so enjoyable. The character development of this woman who lost her son is so good. She is the driving force of the story. Like, more than any missing persons case, like, it's not so much a whodunit story, it's her story. It's her life. It's everything that she's experiencing and feeling in the months after her son disappears. It's the hopelessness that she feels, and the confusion, and the fear, and the utter grief, and it's so beautifully captured. If you kind of like books like that, if you would like a character-driven story like that, I can't recommend this enough, because it was so incredibly well done. And even just beyond her, the whole world was like exquisitely built. Like, you get all this detail. Everything is so well thought out. Like, it's really a masterpiece of world building in a contemporary, because you have all these different characters who are very minor characters in the story, but still have their own lives and their own motivations that you really only see glimpses of, but they're still there. And it really fleshes out this whole world, this whole neighborhood, all these people that she interacts with. It just feels so fantastically well done. The only real flaw I had was the ending, and I don't know that this book could have done it any better. It's just, the thing with missing persons books is that inherently the thing that's compelling is the not knowing. So once you know what happened, whether it's good or bad, positive or negative, no matter what it is, the story immediately loses something, because you lose that mystery. The closure for me is never as satisfying as the mystery. So I think that's why it was 4 stars for me. It's just like inherently it's gonna end on a little bit of an underwhelming note, but fantastic book, so well written. It really makes me want to read more from her. Then I have the library book that I checked out, Emma in the Night by Wendy Walker. I actually saw this in a thrift store and decided not to buy it. I told myself that I could immediately go check it out from the library if I didn't buy it, and I'm so glad I did that, because this was a very 3-star mediocre book. It's a thriller about 2 sisters who go missing, and then several years later, I think like 4 or 5 or something, one of the sisters returns, and it sort of launches an FBI investigation into what happened, where she went, and where her sister is. And her story seems like it's full of holes. There are things that don't add up, there are things that are very questionable, and we sort of just go from there. Like I said, this was 3 stars. It didn't mean a whole lot to me. My biggest problem was the storytelling. So much of this story is told from the girl to the FBI in conversations. And that's not a very compelling way to tell a story. It feels like you're hearing about the action instead of actually seeing and experiencing it for yourself. And when I say action, I don't mean like fighting scenes or anything. I just mean like the things that happened in the story are told to you through a conversation after the fact. And I don't know why you would choose to write a story like that. I understand why. She thought it would work for the story that she wanted to tell, and it does in terms of like the unreliable narrator aspect, which I did enjoy. I do like unreliable narrators, but it just wound up feeling so dry and so boring because it's all just dialogue, basically. She's just telling the FBI what happened, and you're watching her tell it, and that's not very interesting. Beyond that, this book was fine. I don't think it was a bad book. I think that one aspect of the storytelling was incredibly detrimental to it. It's like the only thing that really stood out to me. The rest of it was fine. I do like unreliable narrators. I think it was well done here to the extent that it could be within the storytelling. I thought the story itself was fine. It was just kind of dry and not really one that I super cared about or would recommend. But again, I'm super picky with thrillers, so you might enjoy it more than me. I've actually been dreading talking about this book. The Bright Forever by Lee Martin. I don't remember this book at all. I read this like 2 weeks ago, or I finished it like 2.5 weeks ago probably. I don't remember anything about this book. This book is just a blank to me. This is set in the 70s about a young girl who disappears from a wealthy family in the town. I was apparently very into missing persons cases in the beginning of May, and essentially it's about several people in the town, mostly her brother and a teacher who was tutoring her over the summer break, who is a pedophile, I think, implied pedophile at the very least, and then a kind of ne'er-do-well drunk / drug addict. I don't really remember. And his friendship with the teacher, and it's basically what happened to this girl, and it's told mostly in the 70s but also in the 90s as like, I think 90s or early 2000s, as the characters are like reflecting back on this time. Not a fan. It wasn't bad. I gave it 3 stars, but it's just one of those books that's a blank for me. Like, I don't remember anything about this book. I don't really remember my thoughts on it. Like, it was fine, but like also nothing. The only thing that was really interesting about it was the way it captured like a series of different characters and the unreliable narrator aspect, because some of them are lying to you and some of them don't really know what's going on, so you as the reader are kind of like getting this mixed up account of events that is really kind of interesting. But beyond that, this whole book is so forgettable. Like, maybe one of the most forgettable books I've ever read. Like, as I was literally reading it, I felt like I was forgetting it and just like struggling not to skim everything. Like, I had to go back and reread passages because I was skimming it just because I was like already bored and forgetting it. And I don't know, like, when I talk about it, I'm like, oh yeah, the unreliable narrator is this missing person's case. Like, you get the perspective of this pedophile teacher and like this drug addict and his wife and like the brother who's gone through this trauma, and you see what happens to this little girl, like what happened to her and like why. And it was all like really interesting, objectively speaking, but while reading it, I just didn't care, and also I've forgotten it. So would I recommend this? No. That's kind of my entire thoughts. Snow Falling on Cedars by David Guterson. This is a historical fiction novel mostly set in the 40s and 50s about a Japanese American man who's accused of killing a white fisherman in their village off of Washington State. Really, really interesting. This captures like the whole lives of the town, the community of this small island, and like it goes back through their background, through their childhood. I gave this 4 stars. It was just like exquisitely done. Like, this is a masterful piece of literature, and I actually have like a full review on it coming soon. Hopefully. I filmed it. We'll see when I get around to editing. But it was so well done. You get their history of like being in the concentration camps as Japanese Americans in the 40s. You see their childhood and the way they deal with racism and experience it. And you also see other people in the town, like the town reporter who also grew up with the fisherman who was killed, and the Japanese American man and his wife. And it's all really interesting and well done. And like, this is a book that is largely about racism, and often in subtle ways. Like, there's a lot of overt explicit racism in the book, and like, oh, these characters are racist, but there's also a lot of discussion on characters who are racist but don't see it in themselves. And it was really interesting. It was really well done. Like, it's really a book that captures the whole community, and you get such like a full picture of everything that happened. Like, it's just such a well-written book. I would highly recommend this. I think it's well worth the read. So Far From Home, The Diary of Mary Driscoll, an Irish Mill Girl, by Barry Denenberg. This is part of the Dear America series, which I've kind of been reading through. Really enjoyable books. I try to pick up one every month or so, just whenever I'm like feeling exhausted from my last read, because as much as I enjoyed Snow Falling on Cedars, it's a very dense book, and I enjoyed that. But I wanted something a little lighter after that, so I picked up one of my diaries. These books are all lovely. They're just historical fiction, middle grade diaries about mostly young teenagers who grew up in various times. This is about a girl who grew up in Ireland during the potato famine and then moved to America and worked in a mill here. It also actually deals a lot with racism against the Irish in the 1800s, and it's interesting. I gave it 3 stars. I don't think Barry Denenberg is my favorite author in this series, because I'm getting to a point where I can critique like the various authors and see similarities in their writing styles. This book felt very abrupt, and not just at the ending, but like throughout the whole book. Like, he had a 250-page book that he had to cram into like 190 pages, and just there wasn't enough time to really deal with everything, and there were a lot of things that were glossed over and were kind of like, okay, this happened, we're moving on now. And I've read other books in the series that don't feel like that. It's mostly just his books, where you could have a really short middle grade book that doesn't feel abrupt, that doesn't feel like you're missing things. But I do think the emotion was there, the characters were there. It's a lovely book. I just don't think he's particularly one of my favorite authors in this series, but still well worth the read. I really enjoy all of these, and as always, like, I would highly recommend them, both this and others in the series. Stolen Lives, 20 Years in a Desert Jail by Malika Oufkir. This is about a Moroccan woman, well, not just a Moroccan woman. Her father was General Oufkir, who led a coup against the King of Morocco, He was previously very highly regarded. He was one of the highest ranking men in all of Morocco, and she grew up basically as a foster sibling to the princess and kind of was almost a princess herself for a lot of her life. And her father led the coup against the king and was killed, and then she and her siblings and her mother were held captive for basically 20 years in horrible conditions. And this is her memoir. I gave this 3 stars. I struggled with this book a lot. It was very interesting. It was interesting to read something that I knew nothing about, because like I know nothing about Morocco and I never even heard of this, which I'm trying to read more nonfiction to kind of limit my ignorance a little more, because I do read books like this and it's just like, wow, like it's astounding how little I know about some things. But I will say there were certain things that were hard to follow in this book because of how limited my knowledge was, and she didn't really explain a lot of the context, because this book is about her. It's just about like her life, her experiences. And because of that, I kind of struggled with like what was happening in the background, which I think is a good portion of my fault. I'm not blaming her entirely for that. But even beyond just like my limited knowledge, like she would reference a different coup that happened and then kind of never explain it. So I would then go research it myself. There were other things where like she would mention her father's politics and she had a hard time with her friends and her friends' parents because they didn't agree with her father's politics, and she kind of just brushed that off, but would also reference that like, oh, they thought my father was like a dangerous evil man. And it's like, that's something that I felt like she should have explored in the book. Like, I get that like there are outside events that like I don't know anything about and like that's on me, but there were some more personal things in here that I felt like that was on her to kind of explain to me and like give me the context there, because I never felt like I knew anything about the politics or what was happening, which this all stems from a coup that her father tried to lead, an attempted coup. And I felt like she needed to do a better job of like setting that up so that I would understand it, or the reader, not just me specifically. Again, if you have the full knowledge of the situation, you'd be good, but it seemed like a lot of the things were very relevant to the book, that were relevant to her and her specific experiences, that should have been discussed more. I also struggled with trusting her, kind of. I'm not saying that I thought she was lying, but there were points in this book where, like the coup I mentioned that she never discussed, she referenced that this other attempted coup had happened a few years before her father's. And I was like, I know nothing about this. Let me go like read about it online for like 5 minutes just to like give myself some context. Because I do that sometimes with books like this. It's like, I'm aware of my ignorance, so I'm gonna try to educate myself, kind of. And she said in the book that hundreds of guests were massacred at this attempted coup. But when I looked it up online, everyone was kind of saying 92 people were killed. And that's a very specific number. So it kind of seemed like 92 people were killed, and I don't know where she got the hundreds of guests were massacred number from. And it kind of made me confused, and it kind of made me wonder how much else she'd said in this book that I'd taken at face value that was maybe like an exaggeration, or what she saw at the time. Because it might have just been that like this was the news that she had at the time, like this was what she saw, this was what she was hearing at the time. It wasn't meant to be fully accurate, but it did kind of confuse me, and it made it a little bit like hard for me to like fully buy into everything she said, or like all of the specific like details. Like it's like, are these all accurate? Because I've looked up this one thing and that was not accurate. And then going off of that, there was one point where they were in captivity in the prison, and she talked about her younger sister gaining weight, and she didn't like that her younger sister was gaining weight while they were in prison, might I add, and had been in prison for like years and years at this point. This wasn't like a few months in, this was like years and years in. And she talked about how her sister was gaining weight and they would make fun of her for having gained weight, and she put her on a diet and like rationed her food, and then gave her like an exercise regimen that she made her do. And this was all said in like a haha funny way, which questionable at best, but that's not the point of my discussing this. But then at the same time, she was talking about the fact that they weren't given much food when they were in prison. Like, they had very little food. They were all emaciated and malnourished and like losing so much weight and unhealthy, and they would like eat weeds from the garden because of how hungry they were. And I was sitting here, this was happening like at the same time, you know, like in the same like period of the book. And I was just confused. Like, you say your sister's gaining weight, so you have to put her on a diet, but at the same time you're all being starved and you're just emaciated and malnourished. And I don't understand how those two events were happening at the same time. And I don't know if something was like made up or exaggerated, or if she just like told the timelines badly, but it seemed like those two things were happening at the same time, and it seemed kind of like they were happening like on opposite pages. Like, one page on the book would be like about her sister being fat, and then the other page would be about how they were all starving to death basically. And I was just so confused, and I was like, I don't know how to trust you, because like these two things seemingly contradict each other, and it was very confusing. I just had a hard time like trusting her, and it's not that I feel like her story was a lie. I just don't know if it had something to do with like the flawed storytelling or something. I was just very confused in an unpleasant way. But it was interesting to learn about her life. It was interesting to learn more about Morocco. Like, I really liked seeing her family and all her siblings grow, because a lot of them were very young when they went into captivity. Like, one of them was only 3. So he basically spent his entire life, his entire childhood in jail. And it was really interesting in concept. I just don't think necessarily the book was executed all that well, but might be worth the read if you're interested in this. It wasn't a favorite of mine, but like, I am glad I read it, and I'm glad that I at the very least learned more. Then I read Rust and Stardust by T. Greenwood. This is about Sally Horner. It's a historical fiction set in the late 1940s, early 1950s, about Sally Horner, who was a real girl who was kidnapped and held by a pedophile for several years, almost 2 full years. And it's about her and her life and the people she encountered, and because of that, it is a very sad book. A lot of traumatic things happen in this book, so like it's definitely about a lot of very hard topics. Just keep that in mind going in. Sally Horner was also someone who potentially inspired part of Vladimir Nabokov's Lolita, so she's at least referenced in Lolita. So that is interesting. I gave this 4 stars. I thought this book was beautifully written. I loved her writing style. I loved all the characters. They were so well fleshed out, like just like really, really well done. Like, it was just one of those books that was just like good. Like, her writing was so good. And it's told by multiple people in the story, which I sometimes struggle with when first person books have like multiple narrators, especially when it's more than like a set of core characters. Like, this had a lot of narrators. Like, pretty much anyone who was a character got their own perspective at some point, but they all fit in so well to the story that like it worked really well, and it wasn't confusing, because it just like there were all these different pieces that were just like perfectly fit into the same puzzle, and I really, really enjoyed it. There was something odd about this book, like, that I kind of struggled with, and I don't fully know why. I'm thinking. This book made me feel bad, and I don't know why. It's about a very hard topic, but I read sad books all the time, and usually they make me feel sad, but they don't make me feel bad in an unenjoyable way. And this book did, and I really can't describe why. Like, I genuinely don't know, because I usually like reading sad books. I usually like the feeling of sadness that I get from books, because it's like, it makes me enjoy that. And in this book, I didn't. Like, something about this book rubbed me the wrong way, and I don't know what, because I enjoyed it so much. I don't know. I don't have the words for that, and I hate that I can't explain it, but like, I just can't. The other negative I have was that there were a lot of very convenient coincidences in this book, like overly convenient. There were so many times that like people would offer to help her and then would just like magically disappear that same night and be out of her life. And it wasn't that it happened once or twice, it was how many times it happened. It was just like frequent throughout the book. Like once or twice I could like buy these coincidences, but like when it was constant, when it was every time someone offered help, it was literally a day too late, or they would just like magically for unrelated reasons have to leave that same night and they were planning to help her the next day. It was too much, and it gave this book a sense of unreality that I really didn't enjoy. But I do think overall this was a really fantastic book. I've been wanting to read this for a while, and I'm really glad I finally got to it. I would recommend it if you're interested in this subject, if you can read books about difficult topics like this, because there is a lot of child rape in it, and it is hard to read for that, but I think it's just such a well-crafted book that it's very worth the read. Then we get to my audiobook, which was Southern Discomfort by Tena. I went on a brief road trip, so I listened to an audiobook, which was an enjoyable experience mostly. This is about a woman who was born in Mississippi in 1953. She had very toxic, dysfunctional parents who got divorced when she was 10, which was kind of unheard of at the time. Her parents were very, very wealthy. Her father was incredibly wealthy, like the richest man in town by a long shot, like obscenely rich. And also she was gay, which did not have very much bearing on the book, but she was gay. When I picked this up, I did think it was going to be more about her growing up gay in the South in the 60s. And she technically did, but it very much was not about that. It was pretty much entirely about her toxic, dysfunctional, abusive parents. I gave this 3 stars. I listened to the audiobook, my reading comprehension a little bit lower on audiobooks, so I can't like articulate my thoughts as well, but basically the racism in this book was very hard for me. She used the N-word a lot, like not a few times, not like a dozen times throughout the book, but like constantly. And she did it intentionally to illustrate like the racism she grew up with as a child. She's white. I don't know if I mentioned that. That's very important. But like she grew up in the deep South in the 60s. Lots of racism. And like she was trying to illustrate that and like show the language that like was used around her in her childhood. And like she did it with purpose. But it was so frequent. Like I was listening to this audiobook with someone else in the car with me, and they literally asked me to turn it off because of that, because of how often she used the N-word. And perhaps this would not have bothered me so much if I was reading it, but so much of this book just felt like me listening to this white woman repeatedly saying the N-word, and it was really hard to get through. I also had a lot of trouble with like what kind of felt like her lack of self-reflection. She was very progressive for her time, according to the book anyway. We'll take it at face value. And she disagreed with the KKK quite a bit, which like her family, or at least her father, like did not. And there were different points where she would convince the Black people in her life to do things that were dangerous for them in order to be like progressive and in order to like argue with people. And it was very dangerous, first of all, for the Black people. Like she was a very rich white girl, so she was pretty much safe from whatever, but she put other people in very dangerous situations. And she did acknowledge in the book, she was like, oh, like this was a mistake that I made, but it didn't seem like she often acknowledged like the gravity of that mistake. One point, which was like the most egregious, the KKK was collecting money in Mississippi in like either the late 60s or the early 70s, and she's a teenager, she convinces her Black friend, her Black nanny's daughter, to go with her to confront the KKK. Again, in Mississippi in what I think is about 1969. Like, that's obscenely dangerous. Like, her friend could have been killed. Like, 100%, I'm surprised she wasn't, honestly. And it didn't really feel like she discussed that enough, and discussed like how wrong it was for her to basically bully this girl into going to confront the KKK with her. And it happened a few times, like none as bad as that, but it definitely felt like there needed to be more time devoted to discussing that, because it was more than just like a small mistake, you know, or like a misjudgment or a miscalculation. It was like big things like affecting these people's lives. And as like a wealthy white girl who employed the family, I got the sense that they didn't really feel like they could say no to her. And I also got the sense that she didn't know that, like even in present day when she was writing this book. And it definitely felt like there needed more like reflection there on like the errors of what she did. But overall, the book was like fine. I didn't love it. It was 3 stars. It was kind of just like, if you're interested in reading a book about toxic, abusive parents, you might enjoy it, but there wasn't a whole lot there. And the last book I read was a happy little YA contemporary called Love Maybe by Heather Hepler. This is about a girl whose birthday is on Valentine's Day, but ironically, she is very cynical about love. And then she finds love in this book, so happy, fluffy things. I give this 3 stars. It doesn't sound like my kind of book. It's not. I did actually think this was middle grade when I picked it up. It looks like a very cutesy middle grade cover, and I would have been more down for this level of like fluff in middle grade. It's not my thing. You would probably enjoy it more than me if this is your thing. Like, I feel bad sitting here like trying to give this a review or critique it when it's just like so clearly not something I would ordinarily read. I wanted something really happy after Rust and Stardust, because that book made me feel bad, and I was just like, I want happiness, which is why I occasionally have books like this on my shelf, just so they're there when I want them. And it did give me like that positive feeling back, because it is sweet. Like, it's a cute little romance. She's good relationships with her friends and her mother, and like, you know, everything's gonna be okay. It's one of those books. It's first person present tense, which I don't love, and it's just so fluffy that it was a little bit much for me. The only real critique I had about this book were the jobs of all the main characters. All the adults in this book either own small businesses or are artists, because apparently that's what adults do. But even beyond that, the main character in this book works in a candy shop, which at first I was like, makes sense, like get a little job as like a stock girl for like 10 hours a week. That's what teenagers do. Only like she wasn't. She was the bookkeeper of this candy shop as like a 16-year-old. I was like, that's beyond my level of suspension of disbelief. Like, I just can't. Like, she's 16. She obviously like doesn't know how to do this stuff. Like, it doesn't matter how organized you are. Like, she was talking about how she set up all the contacts with the vendors and like got all the banking stuff in order. And like, as a 16-year-old, there's no way, and I'm not even entirely certain that's legal. And then all of her friends also like worked at that candy shop, but I say worked because they were all volunteers. None of them got paid. I'm not actually even entirely certain that the main character got paid. I assumed she did, because it seemed like she legitimately like had a job there, but they never discussed her getting paid. Everyone else was strictly volunteers because they made jokes about it. And I don't really know why. Like, I don't know why they were all working there, because like this candy shop was not owned by like a friend of the family or anything. They actually talked about how like her mother barely knew the guy and like had only met him like once or twice when she was picking up her daughter. So like, I don't understand why they were all working there. It didn't make sense. And it didn't make sense that she was a bookkeeper. And they talked about her single mother like being short on cash at one point, like how like money was tight in the family, but also she sent all 3 of her kids to a very exclusive private school, and like there was no mention of scholarships or anything, so like I didn't know how that worked. And this probably isn't a book you're supposed to question too much, and like I know that's all very nitpicky, but like it bugged me so much. But it was fine. Like it is what it says it is. Like it's a cute story about a girl who like dates a few boys and then finds one who actually like really likes her, who she likes back. And if you like that kind of thing, you'd probably like this. Okay, not my thing. That was everything that I read in May. It was a pretty good reading month. I had some really good reads there, and some that I'm getting off my shelf, which I feel good about. Let me know down below if you've read any of these books, what your thoughts on them were if you have. And as always, thank you so much for watching, and I will see y'all again soon.